Alright, so hello and welcome back. So we are continuing Bass Battles. We're going to be looking today at the video of the Tokyo Raid 1942. The original video link is in the description if you do not want this long-form commentary, alright? Other than that, there appears to be only one battle left, which is going to be sad for Bass Battles in 1943, alright? So, without further ado, let's get to it.
It is a windy April morning somewhere in the North Pacific Ocean. Wave after wave crashes against the side of the USS Hornet as she pitches violently in the heavy seas. Dozens of her crew bustle around the unusual complement of aircraft on her flight deck. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle does a last-minute check of his plane before ordering the crew to man the bomber. Its propellers cut through the mist of seawater as Doolittle throttles up the engines. An audacious raid that will set the future of the Pacific War is about to begin. It is the 21st of December, 1941, 3 weeks after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that dragged the United States into the World War. The Empire of Japan strides from victory to victory, fulfilling its ambitious imperialistic plans. The beaten U.S. military is in full retreat, and a strong air of doubt and fear run through the minds of American society. President Roosevelt holds a meeting in the White House, anxiously demanding his top military officials to carry out a strike against Japan to give hope and improve the faltering morale of the nation. Within the next month, the military planners explored possibilities to perform an attack on the Japanese home islands. Since the long-range bomber bases in the Philippines were no more, there was no viable way to strike at the heart of the Japanese Empire. Yet, in the first half of January, a brave endeavor sparked within the ranks of the U.S. Navy. One of the captains came up with an idea to launch a number of large Army Air Force bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier. It was never before performed in combat, yet it seemed like the best bet for the American military given the circumstances. Soon, the chiefs of both the Army and the Navy greenlit the project, and the top-secret raid landed on the planning table.
So, why he's talking about the armies because the Air Force One doesn't exist. Now, Henry Hap Arnold, Arnold Air Society, which I was a member of. So there you go. If you know what that is, you know what that is. He was a very big proponent of air power and demonstrated that very thoroughly. I believe he was one of the first to pioneer the fact that you could drop bombs on ships, like, dive bombing ships, right? And the Navy discredited it completely out of hand. They're like, oh, that will never happen. They will never be able to do that. You broke our test rules. Anyway, he was one of the American pioneers of air power. That's why everyone basically kind of remembers him in the Air Force today, or at least knows his name.
At first, just a handful of officers were working on the details of this future mission. On the Army side, the organization and training of the bomber forces was entrusted to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a test pilot and one of the leading figures of American aviation. A number of aircraft were considered for the mission, but only the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber proved to be the one roughly sufficient for the mission.
So let's take a look at these bombers, all right? B-18 Bolo. Now, that and the Dragon, I believe, the B-23 Dragon are both pre-war designs. Like, the Bolo's really old. That's why it was replaced by the B-17. And then you have the B-23 Dragon, which, if I'm not mistaken, was also a pre-war design. Let's just take a look here. B-23. Let's see. So it was a 1939 design, actually. And only 38 of them were built. And it was developed from the B-18 Bolo, which was it first flew in 1935. So again, confirming what I'm saying here. So in reality, the only real two competitions here are going to be the B-25 Mitchell and the B-26 Marauder. Okay, I'm kind of surprised it wasn't the Marauder, but there's probably reasons for that that I don't know, right? But both the B-25 and the B-26 were used during World War II, pretty extensively actually. So that's it.
Mitchell medium bomber proved to be the one roughly sufficient for the mission. In the beginning of February, 2 Mitchell bombers were successfully launched from the deck of the USS Hornet to prove the feasibility of the concept. Originally, planes were to return to the carrier upon dropping the bombs, but this idea was quickly ruled out, as landing such a big and heavy craft on a moving flight deck was bordering on the impossible. Hence, after fulfilling the
Now, if you all play War Thunder, you're like, sir, technically, I'm like, yeah, if you crash the airplane into the deck, it's technically possible to land the B-25, right? But that's a game, all right? In reality, no. You might be able to launch the B-25, which is going to be very hard because not only do you not have all the runway like people think you do, you would not start on the back of the ship, you start forward. Why? Because all the other B-25s are going to be behind you, so they have to take off forward, which means you only get a certain amount of deck space, basically half of the actual landing area on the carrier you're going to be launching from. So this is not going to be a return mission, let alone the fact that I don't even think you could land the B-25 on a normal day in best conditions. It's still bloody hard to land a regular aircraft, a one-engine aircraft, let alone something that heavy. I don't even think the cables would be able to take the an aircraft landing weight of a two-engine bomber. I don't even think it could stop it. It was especially World War II technology here.
The objective, bombers were to land on the continent. The shortest and most obvious route would be to head to the city of Vladivostok, yet negotiations with the Soviets were fruitless, leaving the unoccupied China interior as the only available option, even though the Chinese officials were rightly concerned over possible Japanese retribution.
Now, the Soviet Union is already at war with Nazi Germany. They don't want to also be at war over a diplomatic incident where if B-25 pilots, Americans bombed Japan and then landed in Vladivostok, that would be caused an international incident. Japan would demand the pilots, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, you can see why the USSR was not a fan of that idea, okay? So they don't want to do that. Now, the B-25s are going to shoot for China, free China, which is under basically Chiang Kai-shek and a whole bunch of warlords at this time. I mean, it's basically a free-for-all down there. But they won't get shot if they can land in free China, which is where they're going to and hopefully end up. Now, the mission goes awry for some pilots, and some pilots are not going to be able to make it there, so they actually do land in Vladivostok, in which case they are immediately put in prison by the Soviets. Now, these people are actually, kind of let go. More like they move them down to the Middle East, and then they're like, oh no, it seems the prisoner has escaped. Alexei. Oh no, Vlad, he's gone. Boris, we should go look for him. Yes, I believe he went that way. And the pilot walks off to the U.S. Embassy down there, right? So, yeah, the Russians actually did let a few of those pilots go, so there you go.
Landing in China, however, required some serious modifications of the B-25s to reduce its weight and extend its range by a significant margin. Additional gas tanks were mounted and much of the equipment removed, including radio sets and classified Norden bomb sights. Even the gun of the dorsal turret was replaced with a painted broomstick to save weight. In fact, this entire mission is really a captivating story, really worth exploring its details. Anyway, a couple of weeks of intensive training began in March.
So, an important reason probably why that bomb site was taken out, they're like, look, these aircraft aren't coming back. They're either going to crash in free China, in which case their bomb sites can be taken, or they land intact in China, which are going to be captured or even used by the Chinese, or worse, by the Japanese, and they'll discover it. So that's why that's a good idea to take those out. Now, of course, it's going to reduce bombing accuracy because, you don't have the bomb site, the computer-assisted bomb site, so...
With crew practicing simulated carrier launches, night flying, low-altitude bombing, and more. Since time was of the essence, on the very first day of April, 16 Mitchell bombers were loaded onto the flight deck of the USS Hornet in the San Francisco Bay. On the next morning, the aircraft carrier, escorted by 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, departed the Foggy Naval Air Station, commencing with the mission. On the early evening of April 12th, the Hornets group met with another task force of similar composition, led by the USS Enterprise, the Hornet's sister ship of the same class, which steamed from Pearl Harbor to provide air cover for the entire naval force. Apart from the rough weather, the journey was uneventful, and 5 days later, the U.S. Navy warships readied for a final part of their mission. The carriers and escorting cruisers were refueled and set for a final high-speed dash to the launch area, roughly 400 to 500 nautical miles off the coast of Japan. But soon, the unexpected started to happen. A few hours after midnight, the radar operators on the Enterprise detected a Japanese vessel far outside of the expected patrol area. The Americans luckily avoided detection for the remainder of the night, but in the morning, the USS Hornet made visual contact with one of the Japanese picket boats patrolling the sector. It was quickly shelled and sunk by one of the cruisers.
So a picket boat, again, from my understanding, just a picket line is basically, in military terms, it's like your outer people, okay? If one of those picket lines are hit, so that's what this ship is, if one of them are hit, you know where the enemy is, okay? Or you know a general idea, like our pickets have sighted the enemy, or our pickets have been engaged by the enemy. So you know where it is. So that's what those are. It's been engaged. They're like, there we go. Okay. Oh no, we need to investigate. So you can see how this could be quite a problem.
Yet there was no delusion among the American officers. The Japanese military was already informed of their presence. A war of nerves set in. Every mile into the enemy-controlled waters increased the risk of losing the invaluable American carriers, but also meant increasing chances of Doolittle's raiders.
Now, I believe at this point, I could look this up, but we'll just go off my memory right now. The only carriers that are basically in the Pacific that are already combat worthy, again, are USS Yorktown, USS Enterprise, and USS Hornet, and you also have Lexington and Saratoga. Now, this is taking place, I believe, in April. So the Saratoga, let's see, look. I'll get back to you on that. Okay, so the Battle of the Coral Sea hasn't happened yet. That's actually going to happen a month later, okay? Because this is taking place in April, right? So the USS Hornet, USS Enterprise, and USS Yorktown, those are the three modern carriers that are in the Pacific, okay? We're not going to mention Wasp, and we're not going to mention the other piece of shits that are floating around, technically, and Ranger. I'm making a video on the U.S. fleet after the Pacific, so you're just going to have to wait on that one. It's a bit extensive on what I'm doing there. But anyway, so yeah, these three modern carriers along with the Lexington and Saratoga, okay? Lexington is going to be sunk a month later, so in reality, they have 5 actual operational carriers. These two, if these two go down, it leaves you with 3. You can see how that could quite significantly change the outcome of the early part of the war, especially the Battle of Midway, if these carriers did in fact get sunk because they went too far into Japanese territory and couldn't get out.
Being detected 10 hours before the planned launch, the battle fleet was still around 250 nautical miles from the targeted launch area. Doolittle's plan involved launching at dusk and flying a bombing run under the cover of darkness. But it was decided that the safety of the carriers was of the utmost importance. The weather was unforgiving. The heavy seas washed over the flight deck of the Hornet, but there was no time to waste. At 20 minutes past 8 in the morning, the twin Cyclone engines of Doolittle's leading plane roared as he went full throttle over an unusually short runway for a bomber. His B-25 reached the end of the flight deck and narrowly avoided crashing, almost brushing the waves before pulling up. Men aboard the Hornet quavered, but within the next hour, the rest of the bombers safely got airborne. 5 small groups were formed, and promptly the aircraft took direction towards Japan, flying at minimal altitude to avoid detection. Colonel Doolittle navigated with ease, approaching the eastern coast of central Honshu Island shortly past noon. While the 3 planes stuck to the coast, flying further west to their objectives in Nagoya and Kobe, the remaining 13 bombers targeted factories and military installations within Tokyo and southern Tokyo Bay.
So another thing to point out, Colonel Doolittle actually, 1, will survive this, and 2, be promoted to general, basically, after he gets out, this, and also get the Medal of Honor. He'd actually been a test pilot in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and in the initial war period, he was one of the pioneers of aviation, just in general, for the American military. So he's actually a quite important character himself.
The Americans spotted some training biplanes and flights of Japanese fighters, yet the latter seemed not interested in approaching the Americans. Seemingly, a total surprise was achieved. Upon closing to their objectives, the raiders climbed to a bombing altitude, and each plane dropped 4 high explosives or incendiary bombs. The crews reported visible damage to the targeted objects and large fires spreading around. The air sirens blasted as the Japanese soldiers rushed to the anti-aircraft guns. Their response, however, proved too late and insufficient. The American bombers flew at a very low altitude, and Japanese AA fire managed to score some minor hits on the Seoul B-25 plane. Upon fulfilling their objectives, the raiders headed to the China coast. An emerging tailwind enabled 15 bombers to reach the Chinese mainland. But this was the only good news of the afternoon. For the last 7 hours of the journey, the planes crossed through a heavy storm, which, coupled with the approaching night, meant almost zero visibility. As a result, none of the bombers reached their intended landing sites. In those demanding conditions, the aircraft either crash-landed or the crew bailed out over eastern China. 3 airmen died in the process, and 8 others were captured by the Japanese. Only 4 of those survived the war, making the eventual death toll 7 men. Yet not all bombers reached.
If I remember correctly, I believe some were captured by the Japanese and they were in a hospital. And long story short, the hospital staff opened the doors to the angry Japanese mob outside and they were beaten to death, basically.
China. A lone B-25 suffered from abnormally high fuel consumption due to an unmodified carburetor and was forced to divert northeast after bombing Tokyo, and against orders flew to the Soviet Union, which was officially neutral to Japan. The crew was interned, yet after more than a year their escape was staged, giving the Soviets a plausible excuse to offer the Japanese. The Tokyo air raid inflicted relatively light physical damage, but its psychological impact was massive. For the Americans, the raid gave hope that a seemingly invincible enemy could be defeated, and also became an effective recruitment and propaganda tool. The attack shocked the Japanese leadership, which diverted their limited resources to defend the home islands and put great emphasis on the destruction of the American aircraft carriers. That eventually led to the decisive clash near the Midway Atoll 7 weeks later.
And this is an important fact that the Americans' morale was not exactly doing very stellar at this point, mostly because we had been winning quite basically anything up to this point, okay? A little few minor engagements, but it had been pretty bad. So this really did boost American morale and be like, ha, suck it, Japan. If you want to bomb us, we'll bomb you. And they did threaten the emperor. So also a big point of contention is whether the Japanese forced the Midway engagement because they needed to redeem their honor, because the emperor was almost killed because of their negligence, right? So they could end this war quicker, right? Because again, the war was supposed to end in 6 months, at least in their brains. So the Americans would settle for peace, and then this war would be over. That's not what happens, but hey, that's what they thought. As a response to Doolittle raid, the Japanese launched a revenge campaign to prevent China from being used in such missions ever again. It turned out to be an immensely cruel operation, with the modern estimates putting the death toll at 250,000 people. Yes, this is true. They actually did, after the Doolittle raid, the Japanese military did actually push even harder into China and inflict more war crimes pretty much across the board to the Chinese people, basically just in revenge of the raid. Number 2, some researchers speculate that the one bomber that landed in the USSR was specifically sent there to test the true wartime allegiance of the Soviets and investigate Russian airfields that could be used to bomb Japan in the future. I kind of don't believe that, mostly because, like, even in 45, we just still weren't using their airfield, and they did capture a B-29 super fortress, and they didn't give it back. That's why you got the Tu-4. So that doesn't sound right, but you know. And then number 3, Doolittle believed he would be court-martialed for launching the raid ahead of schedule and for the total loss of aircraft. Instead, he was hailed as a national hero, promoted to brigadier general, and decorated with the Medal of Honor. Yeah, he's like, bro, I lost all my aircraft, and I mean, I did bomb my target, so there you go, but still lost everyone. And yep, American hero. All right, so I hope you guys liked that video. There's another video up there if you want to watch that. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.